years that she'd have one glass of Chardonnay at dinner. My dad, as you may know, didn't drink. And so he must have been talking to Dr. Ware about this, because the fact says, it's in big, bold, Joe Wyatt type writing, it says, oops, we forgot to ask one thing. When, and then in parentheses, how soon, question mark, now, question mark, can Marge return to her usual, and then in parentheses, quondam. Of course, we had to get a little Latin into the facts. And quondam, for those of you who are not Latin aficionados, means as it used to be. When can Marge return to her nightly glass of Chardonnay at dinner? Signed, anxious husband Joe and thirsty wife Marge. I'm going to keep that. Dad was a serious man who didn't take himself seriously. He was a deeply principled man who set extremely high standards, but they were always fair, and he always held himself to the same high standards. He understood that nothing of any significance gets accomplished in this world without enthusiasm. And so he was enthusiastic about everything that he did, everything that he engaged in every day of his life. And he always did it with a smile on his face and a gleam in his eye. If I didn't realize it already, his passing made it very clear how so many friends he had and so many walks of life that he was involved in. There were many, many close friends, of course, and all of you here today fit into that category. But there were others who had met him only once or twice, and I can't tell you how many people I've spoken to over the past few weeks who've said, you know, I only met your dad one time, but I remember this. Or I only met him a couple of times, but he said that. And he made an impression on people, even just in passing. He loved to engage people, he was a great listener, and he was genuinely interested in everyone that he met. I have another story to tell on that subject, because a good friend of mine, a great friend of mine, Sean Hoffman, who was actually the best man at our wedding, and Sean couldn't be here today. He lives in the Washington, D.C. area, and the trip was too far. But he used to live in Southern California, and Sean and I went to visit my folks, and I'm sure it was for a football game at the Rose Bowl, because there was no other reason that Sean would have been with me in Pasadena. And before the football game, we went to visit Mom and Dad, and as Dad always was, he was interested in Sean. Sean was somebody new. And so he asked Sean where he was from, and Sean said, well, I live here in Southern California, but I was born and raised in Erie, Pennsylvania. And without missing a beat, Dad broke into the fight song of the East High Pennsylvania Warriors from Erie. And he sang it, and he sang every verse of the song, and he knew all of the words, and Sean was sitting there. I'd seen this act before. I've never heard him sing this particular song, but I've seen similar things. And Sean's, his jaw dropped, and then he just kind of looked and said, well, how the hell did you know that song? And he said, more importantly, how do you remember the words, Dad said, well, I lived there 70 years ago or something, and he had an incredible, incredible memory. I was going to talk a little bit about Dad's childhood. We haven't talked much about that today, and I thought I would do that to give you a little bit of background. We have some great pictures that Tammy found and put in frames in the back. But one thing about my father is he certainly was not born with a silver spoon in his mouth. Dad was the only child of divorced parents. He lived with his father back in the Midwest during the heart of the Depression, and his father was a traveling salesman. So Dad, up until age 10, he never lived in the same city for more than 6 to 9 months. He had none of the creature comforts that all of us want for our children. And in fact, he told me a story once about how his father and he once camped and lived out of their car for one summer on the banks of Lake Michigan in Chicago. And of course, in typical Joe Wyatt fashion, he told the story with excitement rather than dread. It was a learning experience and something that he carries with him even now, or carried with him at least. But he had no reason to be as successful as he was, at least not by his upbringing. He was a completely self-made man. But one thing that was clear early on in those early years is that he was no average Joe when it came to intellect. He was damn smart. And in fact, he was sharp as a tack up until the day he died. I'd say 3 or 4 days before his death, and Don can attest to this, he was not in good shape. but he was very focused on getting his tax returns done. He was very focused on making sure all the things at work were covered. He was on top of things, and I'll tell you, Don, I in some ways, it may be a good thing he didn't recover, because the doctors at USC would have heard all about it if he had made it through, I guarantee you. There's no question that my father was a superb lawyer and devoted community activist and an avid politico, and you already know that. We've heard that from the speakers. I wanted to tell you a few specific things about him that you might not know. He was a zealous Marx Brothers fan. He loved the Marx Brothers. And he turned me onto them at an early age. And when I was a boy, I would always look in the TV guide for a day at the races or a night at the opera or any one of these wonderful Marx Brothers films. Because back then you couldn't, there was no TiVo, you couldn't record TV shows, you had to watch them when they came on. And what I remember is they usually came on at a time in the early evening when Dad would typically be at work. But he always made the point of coming home to watch them with me, even though he had seen them many, many times before. And on that note, we've got a special treat for you tonight. Can we run the clip?
And now, the summer series of You Bet Your Life. Shows you've said you wanted to see again. It's the best of Groucho. Here he is, Groucho Marx. In You Bet Your Life. Brought to you by Prom Home Permanent. New Creamy Prom. The only home permanent that beauty treats your hair as it waves. And New White Rain. The first and only crystal clear liquid shampoo. And now, here he is, the one, the only...
Well, here I am again with 1,500 smackers for one of our couples. Don't even say the secret word, the duck will come down and pay him $101. The word tonight is smile. Okay, duck, frown and scram. That's a law firm in Philadelphia, frown and scram. George, who's next for prom?
Groucho, our studio audience selected Mr. Joseph Wyatt to be on the show tonight. His partner is Countess Sonia DeAndrea. So, folks, would you come in, please, and meet Groucho Marx.
Welcome to You Bet Your Life. Say the secret word and you each get an extra $50.50. It's a common word, something you always have with you. Joseph Wyatt, huh?
That's right.
Are you related to Wyatt Earp?
No, not exactly.
No. Well, are you married?
I am that. I have a wife and a little boy and another child in escrow, so to speak.
That's a nice place to have it. It's very pretty country around there. What sort of work do you do?
I'm a lawyer.
What kind of a lawyer?
Well, our firm specializes in tax and trust and probate work.
Uh-huh. Well, Joe, aside from your business, what are you interested in, girls?
No, not exactly. I've got a 31-year-old house that we're trying to decorate, and then I have some extracurricular civic activities, the Bar Association, the Los Angeles Junior Chamber of Commerce, and civic organizations like that.
The Junior Chamber of Commerce? That's a real live wire outfit. Now, be frank. Has the L.A. Junior Chamber of Commerce ever accomplished anything of importance?
You know, you realize that Los Angeles business, in the period that the Junior Chamber has been operating, has increased something like 500%, and the population, well, I don't know what it was then, but it's grown to 4 million, over 4 million in the Los Angeles area right now.
And does the Junior Chamber of Commerce take credit for this increase in population?
Not exactly.
That's covering a lot of territory, isn't it?
We don't take credit, nor do we feel responsible, but at least at the beginning, we were begging people to come out here, and now they're coming out of their own free will at the rate of something between 3,000 and 5,000 per month.
Well, Joe, I'm interested in an organization that'll get some of the people out of here. Right now, I'm working on a revolutionary plan for the freeway. The people who think they're going to Glendale and then wind up in Philadelphia. It'll be like one of those mazes they use for rats. Well, enough of this chit-chat. Let's play You Bet Your Life.
We came across that a few years ago. I don't know if Mark Siegel is here today or not. He is. Mark, thank you so much. Mark, I don't know what he did, but he dug through the archives, I think probably on my father's behalf, to find this old archives of old Groucho You Bet Your Life episodes, and he dug that one up, and you should have seen the look on my father's face when he got that. He was so pleased. I think he'd been looking for that for years. But anyways, I hope you don't mind us digressing for a moment. I thought that'd be a little bit of fun. My mother was not as big of a Marx Brothers fan, particularly when my dad would spend time teaching me the words to Groucho's Lydia the Tattooed Lady. And I used to run around talking about when her muscles start relaxing, over the hill comes Andrew Jackson. And Mom didn't like that, but Dad thought it was fantastic. My father was an avid skier and a fisherman. We had wonderful, wonderful family trips, fishing for trout and for salmon up in the Pacific Northwest, and sometimes catching sharks instead. And, I'm sure Dan remembers a lot of those. He usually caught most of the fish, and Dan did a lot of the best skiing, but we had a lot of good times there. Dad was not an accomplished singer, but he loved to sing. And I have very vivid memories of church hymns and Christmas Eve caroling, where this sort of bellowing baritone voice would come out of nowhere and drown out everybody else who thought they were going to be singing that night as well. He was a music connoisseur. He has a wonderful record collection of old, mostly big band albums that I'm sure is worth a lot of money. He's got records, there must be hundreds and hundreds of these records, and he'd play the music all the time. You heard reference to his Latin a little bit earlier. He actually, at a young age, spoke fluent Latin. Now, I don't know that anybody does that except for the Pope, and, but Dad did, and in fact, he earned his scholarship to Northwestern because he won the Illinois State Latin Contest. And that's how he got to college. And by the way, he started at Northwestern when he was 16. And I didn't find that out until a few years ago, and I was going through his college yearbooks and just kind of snooping around, and you know, people write notes in your yearbook, and everybody kept talking about him and referring to him as Little Joe. And I never thought Dad was all that small. He wasn't a big man, but I asked Dad, why are they calling you Little Joe? And he said, well, I was a little bit younger when I started. I said, well, how young were you? 16. I said, well, it's pretty impressive, Dad. You might want to tell me about that sometime. But that goes back to his humility. He didn't talk about himself very much. Dad wasn't a big sports fan, but he knew that I was. And so he would engage me in conversation about topics that I knew he didn't know about, but somehow, some way, he'd always win the arguments. He could carry the conversation even on subjects that he wasn't close to. And I remember very vividly, probably 20 or 30 years back, where we talked about who was the better boxer between Muhammad Ali and Joe Louis, and my dad was quite sure that it was Joe Louis. There was mention earlier about his service, and he was part of the greatest generation, spending 3 years in Europe in World War II. But what you might not know is that while he was in the service, he was a champion table tennis player. And I don't know what that means. I don't know if they give trophies in the service, but he was good at table tennis, and we spent many years in our backyard playing what I call ping pong, and he always took exception to that. Dad loved to travel. And as he got older and was less able to do so, he loved to hear our stories about where we went, where we traveled. And Sunday morning, he would always take time. You know, there's a television show, CBS News Sunday Morning Show, I think it's called. And if you watch that show, at the end, there's usually 2 or 3 minutes where they show this sort of very bucolic scene of somewhere in the country. And he would always make a point to watch that because he wanted to see whatever spots there were that, you know, he couldn't get to anymore. So there's a few things about Dad that maybe you didn't know. You might not know, but you can imagine he was a great, great father, an incredible grandfather, or as we call him, Papa. His stories were always the best in town. And boy, how he loved to tell them. He seemed to know everything. But if there was ever a moment where he didn't, you could bet that you would be going to research it with him somewhere in early years in the Encyclopedia Britannica, in later years on the internet. He took great pride and joy in his grandchildren. was very proud of Jack and Taryn. He'd spend hours playing chess with Jack and matching wits with him, and he would bounce Taryn on his knee and read her books and enjoy that immensely in his later years. So Dad, in your absence, I promise to do my best to do all the things that you taught me and to convey those things to my children. Your example of silent pride, being proud of yourself and not having to talk about it. I'll try not to exaggerate just to make a point, because I don't want to lose my own credibility. In times of trouble, I'll do my best to be the voice of reason and keep my head when everybody else is losing theirs. I'll remember that character counts. It's important to do the right thing, always. I'll remember that a good sense of humor is often your best ally. And I'll have Jack strive to be the gentleman that you were, Dad, although it would be quite a challenge for him to be as charming as you were. That was a compliment to him, Jack, not an insult to you. We'll miss you, Dad. Everything that came with you, the quick wit, the clever quips, the bright smile, the keen intellect, the smart sense of humor, the plaid jackets, and of course the ever-present bow tie, and what somebody else referred to a beret, and I always call a newsboy cap. Speaking for the family, and I don't often do that, but I feel comfortable in this moment, we're all so proud to be a part of your legacy. So, with that, I hope you all learned a few things about my father that you didn't know. And what I'd like you to do now is to put your hands together and let him know how much he meant to you. I knew that would be the riskiest part of this speech because it might never stop. I now want to share with you a little bit, and I'm going to have my son Jack come up and do a special reading. But I want to give some context to it. Like most families, the Wyatts like to celebrate birthdays, and probably like most families, we often had to celebrate them on days that weren't the actual birthday, because of people's schedules, or perhaps the birthday fell on a Monday instead of a Saturday or Sunday. We'd often be having the birthday on a different day. My dad always took that opportunity to do a reading from this book, Alice in Wonderland. And he would talk about unbirthdays. And he would always make a point of doing the reading during one of these birthday celebrations. And so we thought it would be appropriate for Jack Wyatt to come up and read that passage for you all. So Jack?
Okay everyone, I'm a crack under pressure, so don't blame me. I'm going to start now. It's a cravat, child, and a beautiful one, as you say. It's a present from the White King and Queen. There now. Is it really? Said Alice, quite pleased to find that she had chosen a good subject after all. They gave it to me, Humpty Dumpty said, as he crossed one knee over the other and clasped his hands round it. They gave it to me for an unbirthday. I beg your pardon, Alice said with a puzzled air. I am not offended, said Humpty Dumpty. I mean, what is an unbirthday present? A present given to you when it isn't your birthday, of course. Alice considered a little. I like birthday presents best, she said. You don't know what you are talking about, cried Humpty Dumpty. How many days are there in a year? There are 365, said Alice. And how many birthdays have you? One. And if you take 365, what remains? 364, of course. Humpty Dumpty looked doubtful. I'd rather see that on paper, he said. Alice couldn't help smiling as she took out her memorization book and worked the sum for him. 365 minus 1 equals 364. Humpty Dumpty took the book and looked at it carefully. That seems to be done right, he said. You're holding it upside down, Alice interrupted. To be sure I was, Humpty Dumpty said gaily, as she turned it around for him. I thought it looked a little queer. Wait, oh yeah, okay, here we go. As I was saying, that seems to be done right, though I haven't time to look over it thoroughly just now, and that shows that there are 364 days when you might get an unbirthday present. Certainly, said Alice. And only one for birthday presents, you know. There's glory for you. And this goes out to my papa. I hope you not have fun. I hope you rest in peace and have the best unbirthday of your life.
Okay, well, we're now going to have George Van Alstyne come up.
And Joe the lawyer, and Joe the political activist, and Joe the market.